Barry Marate. I'm the founder of a startup here in DC called Textiles, doing clothing recycling. And I'm here to introduce panel one. If our panelists could please come and take their seats, and to introduce our moderator, Karin Benbar, who is the editor of Retail Dive and the co-founder of the Pop Fashion podcast and a great friend of mine. And they're going to be talking about the economics of fashion. Woo! One other thing, you have all received note cards in your bags. If you have any questions, please write them on the note cards, and we have 2 volunteers that will be that are in black that can take your note cards and pass them on to the moderator.
Hello, everybody. Oh.
Hello, everyone. I don't have to yell. My name is Karin, and thank you so much for joining us.
We're going to talk about some really hard things about fashion and macroeconomics. But first of all, let's let everybody introduce themselves.
I'm Allie Gardner. I'm the Special Projects Manager for Free the Slaves, and I manage our fashion industry relationships.
My name is Matt Hamilton. I work for Fair Trade America, which is affiliated with Fair Trade International, and I'm our cotton and textiles lead.
Good morning. I'm Sabine Hertfeld. I work at the World Bank for the International Finance Corporation. I lead the Better Work program, which is a collaboration, a partnership between the IFC and the International Labor Organization.
Hi, my name is Colleen Scott. I work with Goodweave International, and I'm the Director for Apparel and Home Textiles, transferring the Goodweave system from carpet to apparel.
I'm Pietro Rivoli, and I'm on the faculty at the Business School at Georgetown, and I've been studying this industry for a number of years.
So we've talked about Bangladesh already today, and we're going to continue talking about it. So the first question that I have is about Bangladesh and what's happening right now. About 2 weeks ago, the minimum wage was raised, which is really impressive on the surface, especially because, as was mentioned before, it's the second largest producer of apparel in the world behind China. And raising the minimum wage, it went from about $63 to $95. It sounds really great on the surface. However, there were union leaders and also analysts who came and said, not so great, because this is only a little bit more really to survive in this economy. Garment workers have to make at least $350 a month. This $95 is not going to work. So, my question is any raise within the garment industry in Bangladesh progress, or is this kind of a slap in the face? What do you think? An easy question.
However,
You can pass it down to if anybody
I have what I have a thought.
Yeah.
So I personally think I'm probably leaning a little more towards slap in the face here because it's not enough. And as Lauren mentioned, it's so important to be providing a living wage. Minimum wage is not enough in most contexts. And from our point of view at Free the Slaves, poverty is a huge driver of the vulnerabilities that lead people into slavery or into forced labor, whether that's because they're in a factory and working under slave labor conditions, or because maybe they have a health crisis and can't afford to pay for a hospital bill or a doctor and have to take out a loan, and then they're indebted, and that leads to another type of slavery. And so I think these economic barriers lead to really serious issues beyond just the fact that maybe there's poverty existing.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about fair trade and our perspective. We were the first ethical certification that included a time-bound commitment for implementing a living wage. And so, factories have a 6-year time frame that they can start paying a living wage, and we use what's called the anchor methodology to determine what a living wage is. And so, minimum wage is just not enough. And I think that, the more that ethical certifications can recognize that a living wage is the way to go, and having that be credible, right? Because, some of you in the room are probably familiar, H&M has made a commitment to pay a living wage. Clean Clothes campaign has been very critical of that. And so, it's really got to be grounded in credible methodology. So that's kind of our perspective.
Yeah, from the Better Work perspective, I just want to introduce maybe who's aware of the Better Work program. A few people. Okay, but there's also a number who haven't heard about it. So let me just, in a nutshell, explain. This is a program that is done in partnership between the IFC and the ILO, and that measures compliance with local labor law and international labor standards. It started in the early 2000s in Cambodia because there was a trade agreement between Cambodia and the United States, under which Cambodian manufacturers could export to the United States if labor conditions and labor standards under the local labor law were being met and were being monitored. And that's how the program emerged. It's now active in 7 countries around the world, and we're active in about 1,500 factories. We partner with most of the major US and European-based brands and they commit, when they become a brand partner of Better Work, to continue sourcing from the factories, to use our audits, our assessments that we do as ILO and IFC in the factories, and to continue working with the factories as they improve, to become in full compliance with the local labor laws and the ILO core labor standards. And of course, one of these fundamental issues is minimum wage. As the ILO and IFC, we are not going to express an opinion about whether the particular minimum wage in Bangladesh is the appropriate one. It should be the reflection of how the social partners in Bangladesh agree, and that's always a function of the unions will of course push for more, and the businesses will say, look, if we need to factor this into our costs, this is going to put us out of business. And we know this is an industry with thin margins where investors are always going to where the lowest costs are. And we know that there's emerging hubs coming up in East Africa where the labor cost is even lower and where you don't have a legally mandated minimum wage. So it is a very complex topic. What I can tell you is that Bangladesh as of today has not ratified the ILO Convention on Minimum Wage, Convention 131, which says that a minimum wage should reflect the basic needs of workers. But it is at a point where the social partners have agreed that this is feasible. And to answer your question, in my view, it is progress because it is more than what it was, but it's always a tension, and it will always reflect that inherent tension, which ultimately boils down to consumers willing to pay more for clothes. And in that perspective, we are lucky and privileged here to sit in Washington, D.C., and some of us are able to make that choice to pay more, but there's also a lot of people, low-income people who are not able to afford. And so when I think about this issue, I always feel like we need to also remember that for a lot of people who don't have our purchasing power, they are also like to buy something new once in a while and look pretty. So there is a reason why prices have gone down over the last few decades, because there's a demand and there's an expectation from consumers to pay less. All of that we're discussing today, and we need to think through how we, in our little bubble, what we can do. And I really like the opening remarks and also what Lauren was saying. It has to start from consumers like us who are more privileged, who are able to drive this conversation. But then ultimately, to really make a dent at the global scale, we need to get traction and find a way where fashion is not environmentally damaging and pays a living wage to people so that workers are not suffering. But it's not sort of an easy answer and an easy fix. I will leave it at that.
Yeah, and just some brief remarks from Goodweave's perspective. These issues are global, because as Sabine mentioned, the fashion industry is not tied inherently to a single country, and so there's a lot of transferability of sourcing. And so these decisions, we're interested in contributing to the global dialogue on wage issues. Living Wage Coalition, for example, and contributing to that body of work and information so that we can all be making informed decisions of what is in fact a living wage in these environments, and that the decisions are being taken at that macro global level with an understanding of each unique country, but that decisions within one country could end up inherently disadvantaging that country because it becomes less competitive. So thinking of it in that macro environment.
So I would agree with both of you that we can't ignore the potential employment effect of raising the price that we pay for the workers who do the work. But I also think there's an interesting theme emerging in some of the recent research, not just in this industry, but overall. And there is becoming a finding that's becoming more and more verified that if you pay workers more, sometimes they become a more profitable investment. Okay? In other words, if you pay workers more, then you have more of an incentive to increase your investment in their skills development. So, and we've seen this in a number of other industries. I like to tell a quick little example of this high school kid that I hired to look after my little kids after school about 20 years ago. When I gave her a raise, okay, she started to do the dishes. And I often think back to that because what it suggests is that, raising a wage can in some ways make somebody more productive in a variety of mechanisms. So it doesn't necessarily, just become a hit to the bottom line. That said, I think that the major thing that we would need to watch out for, besides the production moving to someplace like East Africa, I think the major effect of raising the cost of labor is actually hastening the move towards technology. Okay? So we now have sew-bots. Okay? Sew-bots are capable of sewing home textiles, towels, sheets, pillowcases without any human labor, okay, at a sewing machine. We can do socks with no human labor, and we can now do t-shirts with no human labor. So this whole idea of, you need all these people sitting at a sewing machine is, I think, not going to be true in as little as 10 years. And as you raise the price of paying people, that will accelerate. So that's just another impact that we have to think about.
Another thing that's happening right now is that we are in the middle of a trade war with China. And this is a very, I know, touchy subject for a number of reasons, but the thing that I really want to focus on is the impact to supply chain and also the impact to consumers. So my question is, so the trade war is projected to raise prices. And a number of companies have already come out and said, yeah, we're going to have to raise prices. Gap has said it. Walmart has said it. J.Crew has said, we're not going to raise our prices. So I want to discuss a little bit about how increasing tariffs between China and the U.S. can impact the supply chain and also what it means for consumers. Now, one thing I know with one microphone, it's really easy to be like, let's go back and forth. But also feel free to, if you want to pass it around a little bit outside of that, feel free. If you want to abstain for certain reasons, that's okay too. So tell me what you think about the potential impact of what's going on with China right now.
Not my expertise.
I can add just one kind of funny anecdote is that with the current administration talking a lot about, we don't want free trade, we want fair trade. We've got a lot of confusion with consumers. We get an inquiry at least once a month saying, really want to support the Trump administration's fair trade initiative. And so that's interesting. We've had to kind of re-clarify what we mean by fair trade. But in terms of your question, I think that the production has already been shifting away from China just because the cost of productions as wages have gone up. have increased, so I think that we're just gonna see that continue. Production's gonna shift to countries like Bangladesh, countries where, there isn't a longer history of kind of factory compliance and that sort of oversight. So it's interesting to see how brands are, trying to do it right, going into countries like Myanmar, going into countries like Ethiopia, and really trying to be more thoughtful about compliance. But of course, we need to see how that plays out in the long term.
And actually, as a follow-up, what do you tell people about the difference between fair trade and free trade? Can you tell us?
Fair trade, so we have kind of 10 basic principles. I couldn't recite them off the top of my head. But yeah, basically we're looking at trying to correct power imbalances in trade, right? So looking in the fashion industry, looking at cotton, there's a huge amount of imbalance, right? Particularly West Africa, India, small producers that's like our bread and butter, focusing on small producers. And for a long time, U.S. subsidies in cotton really affected the industry. And 2005, Brazil brought a case in the WTO, kind of calling to end these subsidies. And so there's been some reform in terms of how agriculture is funded here in the U.S. and other countries, but those effects are still we're still seeing those effects today. And so fair trade is really about advocating for smallholder farmers and giving them a greater voice in trade so that they can share the wealth, share the benefits.
Anyone else would like to speak to it? China trade?
So I agree that the tariffs are probably not going to be as effective in changing trade patterns as they would have been, say, 5 years ago, because apparel production is leaving China rapidly because not just of rising labor costs, but labor shortages. But I would kind of give the same answer. So, the difficulty of importing clothing or importing anything else under current trade war developments, just becomes riskier and riskier because you never know what the administration is going to do. You don't know who they're going to target next. And all of that, I think, is having an intended effect, which is various levels of reshoring, because you avoid all these risks and all these problems if you do it in the United States. And that exacerbates my earlier point. So this reshoring is happening, okay, but it's being done through automation. And so if you scan the press, you'll see a lot of apparel production, is now coming back to the Deep South, for example. So I think that, from that perspective, that's one of the big effects, is it's just hastening, that development. Because we can't reasonably use the same production methods in the United States as they use in Bangladesh. We don't have that number of people. We don't have people who want to do that work. Instead, we have capital and technology. And so I think that's the biggest effect.
And with regard to what that does to prices, from my perspective, the concern is as brands increase or have increases to their price, the purchasing price, they'll be looking for ways to drive prices down within their production model. And so the risk being that pushes production further into a hidden workforce. Outsourcing happens so that traceability that they inherently depend on in their supply chains becomes more hidden, and that has a greater negative impact in informal workforce. So I would be keeping an eye on that and what that inherently will mean for hidden labor, hidden supply chains within the production.
So touching a little bit more on trade war stuff and just its implications, there is this line of thought that happened that if tariffs increased between the United States and China, some people within the fashion industry were like, that's actually good because it might stop intellectual property theft, which means that designers can hold on to their designs and they won't be copied. But what's playing out now is that maybe it has nothing to do with intellectual property ownership, but there's going to be an increase in counterfeits because of it. That it's going to shift, that the production is going to shift, and that counterfeits are going to be entering into the market because the buyers will be there. Can we talk a little bit about counterfeits in general and how it affects the labor force and what's happening right now with it?
Yeah, so I was actually just telling Karin last night, Free the Slaves is about to publish a report that we're calling a crime within a crime, and it's all about slavery within the counterfeit industry, which is something that I don't think we often think about. There's not a lot of data on this, but we can see that countries that have a propensity to export counterfeit goods also have high prevalence of slavery, according to the Global Slavery Index. And so there's a correlation going on. There's also an issue of, there's a lot of anti-counterfeit companies, organizations out there that are working to eradicate the problem, but when they find places where this problem is occurring, there's not usually an anti-slavery lens put onto their approach. And so what they do with the people who are making these items is pretty much unknown. And Free the Slaves has started partnering with anti-counterfeit organizations to try to remedy that, to enter into that space and say that these people who are making the products need to be, reintegrated into their communities or supported in some way after the fact, because legal recourse is available for them. I think that's something that is just now coming to light in the anti-slavery field, at least. We're just starting to look at it, and I'm hopeful that consumers will become a little more aware and think about before buying the fake product whose hands made it, who made my clothes.
A little bit more about counterfeits, whoever feels like talking about it. So I just read a report where many people who buy counterfeits don't know they're actually buying them. And also, in August, there was a big bust on counterfeits between the Mexico-US border, and those products looked so exact to what was real. It was Gucci, it was Prada, it was a bunch of fakes that came through, that even the things that were meant to stop them, the holograms, like how can you reproduce a hologram? Oh, the holograms were the same. So a lot of times consumers, I think there's becoming more of an awareness that I don't want to contribute to the counterfeit industry, but sometimes we don't even know we're buying them. So I think as consumers, how can we be thoughtful about those purchases, about, is this from the place that I think it is? And I know this is a really hard question, but if anybody wants to try to tackle it or add a little bit to it.
I mean, for us, this is not the focus of the program. We work with high street brands. We don't work with the top fashion labels. So we work with brands like H&M and Zara, Nike, Puma, and we work in their top tier 1 suppliers, which are the larger suppliers that they source from across the 7 countries, where something that connected to what Whitney was talking about the Me Too movement in the fashion industry, in which we also see very much as one of the areas that comes up in our assessments and in our work, our training and advisory work in factories, is that you have a lot of sexual harassment, and it's very hard to find it as the ILO and IFC coming in, and the program is primarily implemented by ILO. ILO staff goes and audits, this unannounced audits at the factories, and sees what is in compliance with the local labor law, what is not, and then starts to set up worker management committees and trains both management and workers on how to improve certain issues. When it comes to sexual harassment, there are trainings that we are providing to explain, define it, sensitize. But what we've also done recently, and what I think is another part of the issue, is that very often in 30 factories where we've done a pilot last year, is you see a lot of the women, 80% of the women, of the operators, women, 80% of the sewing operators are women, but only 5% of the line supervisors are women. And so you have this typical environment where you have women in power, men in power positions, that is very conducive for sexual harassment. So what we're doing, what the program is doing, is really looking at the root causes of what's the problem and then trying to find solutions, building it from the ground up, and that takes a very long-term and patient approach. So what we've done in these 30 factories is start to train women with the technical skills they need and the soft skills they need, and working with the managers in the factories to more identify female talent and then promote them. So we've done a training for a few hundred women. Many of these women were then offered positions, promotions to become line supervisors, and for the first time in many of these factories, there are now women that are line supervisors, which is great for gender equality, but also has an impact on sexual harassment reduction. I'm giving you that as an example because it illustrates the approach of the program, which very much goes down to, okay, there's a problem, we need to get to the root cause and then address that, which is a very patient, long-term approach. It's working with unions, working with employers, with the government, with policymakers, with industry associations, and it is it's not something we're going to fix overnight. And yes, there was a lot of momentum after Rana Plaza, but I think we need to recognize that these are very complex issues that you don't fix, and we know that consumer attention is critical to bring these issues to light, but sometimes it's easier to put a spotlight on things, which I think is very important and critical, but if you really try to solve the issues, it's not always easy, it's complex, you need to work at many different levels, at the policy, at sector level, you're talking about macroeconomics and competitiveness between countries. The brands are also just being pressured by consumers who are expecting lower prices, so it's a really complex set of issues which I think you need to do in a very holistic way, and that's what the program tries to do. It's working with brands, it's working through the World Bank at the policy level, it's working to train unions who are often training labor inspectors to do their job, because ultimately measuring compliance should be the job of labor inspectors, but they're very frequently in developing countries under-resourced, so the capacity is low. So it's working with all different actors, and I think we as consumers have an important role to play, consumers in the West. But to solve issues, you need really a lot of patience, a lot of goodwill, and a lot of data also to show evidence-based what works in one country. We think that we've come a long way, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. And on the issue of sexual harassment, I think this is great that the Me Too movement that started in the United States in the movie industry is really bringing these issues to light, which we know have existed for a long time, but when we do the assessments in the factories, this is not something that a worker will easily open up on. When in an interview with an ILO representative who comes to do an assessment, it's very difficult to create that environment of trust where somebody is going to openly talk about this. So we've known it's there, and that's why the Me Too movement is actually fantastic, because it makes it a little easier. Brands are identifying it as a big issue, and so they're having a lot of gender programs around this. We know the brands are very interested in the trainings that we started to do to promote women to line supervisors, because before they would just bring in men from other factories, assuming that men were better equipped to supervise. They wouldn't. I mean, some factory managers wouldn't think of women potentially being able to do it, and oftentimes it's also cultural bias and women who, many in our pilot, many of the women who were offered promotions also didn't accept it because they didn't feel the support from their husbands, the communities, or oftentimes they would have to stay there, they would have to work longer hours, and then transport issues. So it's really complex. But what I think the point I'm trying to make is that these movements that start here in the West are making certain issues more, bring them at light and start to push the agenda. And that's where groups like today, where we are here together with more activist people like yourselves, or People who really genuinely can start movements are so important, because it's especially with interconnectivity and the the information spreading so quickly now in the world. Sometimes all it takes is a spark. Who would have thought today where we would be today? How long is it ago that we had the Me Too started? It's less than a year, I think, and look what's happened. And the brands are really, really keen to work on this issue of sexual harassment. I think it's in part because it's become such an important topic. So these are my thoughts on counterfeit.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I want to talk about slow fashion versus fast fashion. Is slow fashion the answer to fast fashion? And really, as consumers and as apparel lovers, as jewelry lovers, what can we do to still participate but have positive influence around us and with our dollars?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so slow fashion for me is about being more, it's not, we talk about the slow food movement, so slow fashion isn't necessarily about slowing things down and like hand weaving everything, right? It's about being more thoughtful about how you produce clothes from the cotton farms all the way up to the factories. And so that's, something that Fair Trade's obviously really focused on, especially at the tier 3 level, so looking at cotton in particular. Fashion Revolution, they do their transparency index every year, and this year there was only one brand that disclosed their tier 3 suppliers. So brands just aren't, they're starting to get more concerned about where the cotton's coming from and how the workers are being treated and that sort of thing, but it's still not a primary focus, and it really needs to be. Because there's just so many issues that are going on at that tier 3 level. And so that's kind of what Fair Trade is focused on. And then obviously within the tier 1 level, looking at factories and trying to figure out how to be more thoughtful and really redefining the way that we're producing clothes. So the way that it's working currently, brands kind of have a lot of the power, right? And so initiatives like the Better Buying Initiative, which is looking at how brands what are their purchasing practices vis-a-vis factories, right? Because a lot of these issues are coming from the brands, right? They want quick timelines, quick turnaround at a good price, and that's putting a lot of pressure on factories to lower wages, increase working hours, and so looking at ways that we can give more power back to factory owners, factory workers, and kind of share that balance a little bit better. And that's something that we're trying to do. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so that's something that we're trying to do in the Fair Trade Standard. Sorry. That's something that we're trying to do with our textile standard is, incorporating things like lead times, making sure that lead times are fair to factory workers. And factory owners, and then kind of talking to Sabine's point, so making sure that workers are involved with the social compliance process. So if you have a workers committee, you need to make sure that there is adequate gender representation on that workers committee, and that's something that's within the Fair Trade standard. Because obviously issues like sexual harassment, women are not going to feel comfortable talking about that to an all-male workers committee. So to me, that's kind of excuse me, what slow fashion is all about, right?
And I think it comes down to getting an increased awareness of where our clothes are coming from. So it may not be, to earlier points of the exclusivity of slow fashion, the exclusivity kind of limitation in terms of access for all to these very niche production, but thinking about it as an increased awareness of where our clothes are coming from, an increased awareness of what it takes to create fast fashion, to get prices down that low, becoming more aware of what those low prices really what's driving that, and so as we understand, from Goodweave that there is very, very often an informal workforce at play within the formal supply chains. Brands have gotten good at understanding their tier one large factory, what's happening at that large production level. What they're not seeing is that hidden supply chain that oftentimes, to keep prices at that point, are being driven to the informal sector, even sometimes within the factory that goes undetected, and then outsourcing to dedicated centers that do not reach that same level of production standard, and to homework even. And that's where we see instances of child labor and conditions of modern slavery. And so having a greater understanding of those dynamics that are at play, and finding ways to address those root causes. Oftentimes we see child labor in supply chains for surprising reasons. It's often assumed to be an economic driver that households need more income. What we also see is children end up in the supply chain because there's not an alternative. There aren't schools. They don't have access to education. And so simple things like getting identification cards for children, helping them gain access to the education system, can make these incremental changes of getting them out of the supply chain so they're not at home helping their parents beat a garment. They're able to gain access to education and get them out of the supply chain. So getting back to the original question is, I think it's really starting to take a deeper look at those drivers, those economic drivers that get slow fashion and thinking about, or fast fashion, and thinking about how we can address that within supply chains. So two things. From Free the Slaves' perspective, I totally agree with what Colleen was just saying. We actually don't specifically do supply chain work, but we partner with organizations like Goodweave or Verite who do that work in factories and supply chains. We do even further back community-based work, because I think a big thing that can help solve this problem is education before anyone even enters the supply chain or even enters the factory. So an example could be, if there are no schools or no access to education, we can go in and partner with a local NGO in that community, in that source community, to make sure people are aware of their rights, to make sure kids have access to school, to make sure that there are jobs available for the adults so that they don't have to send their children to school, things like that. And then I think the other thing I was going to say was, your question was, is slow fashion the answer? And I think it's one of the answers. I think it is important, but I also think campaigns like Love Clothes Last are really important, that we think about as consumers better respecting the clothing we have. Rebecca Ballard, who's somewhere in this room, has talked in the past about seeing clothing as an investment and really valuing it and not just a disposable item to throw away. And that has been something in the past couple of years I've been trying to hold on to. Like, maybe I will spend a little bit more, but I'm going to really try to value this piece and hold on to it, because I know that the hands that made it were really worthy and put a lot of effort into it.
One thing that I wanted to follow up a little bit on is the idea of hidden work has come up a number of times. And is that happening everywhere where garments are being made? Because the point that was made earlier about the New York Times article about Italy that just came out, I think was a surprise to everybody, that luxury houses are outsourcing work to home laborers, where they're making some of the best designer clothes in the world. And can we talk I know we've mentioned it in a little bit, but can we talk a little bit more about like that hidden work that's happening, and how can we bring that to light?
Very quickly, I think it wasn't a surprise to me, because I think even if, even something that's made in America, a lot of times we'll hold that to a high standard, say it's made in the USA, it's local here, but where are the materials coming from? Free the Slaves works a lot with raw materials, and if you don't know who's picking the cotton, or in other industries, mining, there's going to be slave labor involved. I think having transparency throughout is super important.
Yeah, just quickly, I would agree with that as well. A lot of the big issues are taking place outside of the Tier 1 factory. A lot of the focus has been on Tier 1 since the 90s, and so for a lot of brands, they've disclosed those factories, but they're not necessarily disclosing their subcontractors, which is, you know, where a lot of these issues take place, and that's why I think different initiatives, different certifications need to be thoughtful about how you're incorporating subcontracting into that. And it's difficult, it's very difficult, even for the factories themselves sometimes to trace this work that's taking place outside of their walls. And so for brands, it's also difficult, it's a really opaque process. But I think that's where a lot of the issues are taking place, and we need to really focus on that.
Can I ask you, can you explain the difference between tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3?
Sure, yeah, sorry. So tier 1 is, you know, the factory where things are produced. Tier 2 would be a subcontracting facility, so it could be like a dyeing house, something like that. And then tier 3, I'm referring to like a cotton farm. So it could be other types of facilities that are focused on that level.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, and I'm sure many of you have read, we talked about Italy, but it's also in England. There was a recent, was it an FT article that was talking about the practices in factories in Manchester, where you also had a large number of people employed that were earning less than the UK minimum wage. So we shouldn't think of these issues as purely issues that happen in developing countries. You know, we talk about reshoring, but this also happens in the United Kingdom and in other countries. So, as I mentioned before, it's a huge issue, and we need to make sure that the governments, who are the very governments that are also working and through their development aid are supporting this work in developing countries, they also need to clean up what's happening in their own backyards and have the labor inspectors comes in and do raids just like it's being done in developing countries.
I guess one lens I would put on this question is just for us to think a little bit about the business problem that this response is, allegedly solving, and then maybe think about alternative solutions. So I have a former student who has an apparel startup, and she anticipated a lot of different challenges that any startup might anticipate. But one challenge that she has run into, which she didn't anticipate, is that she cannot place her orders into Goodweave because the big factories are locked up, either in reality or just by contract. There needs to be a business solution for where this unpredictable demand comes from. Because if a brand all of a sudden says, "Oh my gosh, we thought we needed 10 million pink sequin T-shirts, but it's 30 million." Okay. But the good factories are all locked up. Then what? So I think this is a problem, asking for a business solution to a capacity challenge. Okay.
I will address too. So Goodweave works with a lot of the major brands and retailers, and it's interesting having conversations with them and helping them understand what their supply chains look like. There was a major European retailer who we've been speaking with in India, where some of our footprint is, and their position of, well, we look into this, we have our systems, we're very confident, we know this isn't an issue. Your program sounds interesting, sure, let's look at it, and going to do a field visit, going to some production sites. Very unintentionally walked into an outsourced facility, a dedicated center, and found that brand's label, which was not intentional from our part and an absolute shock to them. And the producer feeling very proud of their production and saying, "Oh yeah, we've worked with, we've been producing for you for years." And that lack of visibility into that, what was happening. And so even brands and retailers who feel very confident in their practices, who feel like they have footprint on the ground, they know they're there, they're present, they feel comfortable about what's going on in their production system, have surprises. And it is widespread, and it is a structural result of these systems that it happens, and we see that. And so it's getting to identify that transparency, and be able to map what supply chains look like. And so that's where Goodweave is working with these brands to help them map from these core tier 1 factories that they have the relationship and they source from to see where else does that purchase order go in the supply chain. So from the tier 1 factory, where are the dedicated centers, where are the outsourced facilities, where are the home facilities that are engaged supplying to that and meeting that supply for the purchase order. So creating that mapping, and technology is a big part of that. So Goodweave is developing a system, data platform that helps brands map their supply chain and see what that looks like and visualize. A major U.S. retailer felt very confident they had, I think, they knew about maybe 5 suppliers that they worked with in India. Their map has about 140 units that they were unaware of. So it's helping brands see where else is that production happening, so that they can then put policies in place that provide the benefits that they intend to extend to their labor force, and so that's kind of our vision on that.
Maybe just to add to what Deirdre was saying about the unpredictability of orders, I think another thing we haven't talked about, what you see is a growing trend in the industries for the larger brands to source from fewer suppliers. So there's consolidation going on in the industry, and where before a brand would source from a few hundred different suppliers across the world, now they're targeting 40, 50, 60 that are much bigger and larger, and really having sort of partnerships where the brand cannot live without the factory and vice versa. Which then, reduces some of that unpredictability. I think that's also actually a trend that is positively impacting a number of the dynamics we talked about.
That's actually a really nice bright light that we can end on. I want to make sure we still have time for questions, and so I know that there's some note cards being passed around. Oh, there's some long ones. This is an interesting issue. As someone newer to the industry, how can I help change perspectives on unpaid internships? I'm finding that even companies who say they are ethical and meticulous about their supply chains still have unpaid labor in their main office. And this builds on what we were just talking about. So I think this is a hard question, but a lot of unpaid internships happen in this country. And can we talk to that a little bit?
So actually before my fair trade, and I worked for Ralph Lauren as well. Before that, I was an intern for the UN in Geneva, and I actually was really involved with trying to get the UN to pay their interns. So I actually started a little group called Unpaid is Unfair, and so there's a lot of fairness in my life. Yeah, it was something that we focused on, and basically what we did was to highlight UN principles on basically fairness in terms of pay. And so, in the Declaration of Human Rights, there's actually a clause that talks about people are entitled to fair and just remuneration. So I think that the more you can highlight existing principles, the more that you can bring these issues to light, the better. And I think that people are starting to shift. Actually, the World Health Organization just announced that they're going to pay their interns after a very long campaign trying to get them to pay their interns. So that's changing, and I think that it has to change in the fashion industry as well, because there's a lot of, and rightly so, criticism of the fashion industry of being too exclusive, and people can't afford to go work in New York for free for a whole summer. It's only certain people that are really able to do that, and I think that the objective of the fashion industry should be to be more democratic and more open to people from all different backgrounds. So I think it's a great question.
From my perspective, the answer to that question lies in the law, right? If the law has a minimum wage that applies to the situations, then that's what should happen. People should be paid. If this is an internship in the context of studies, that's typically outside the scope of the legislation, then no. But, I have my own personal moral ideas about this, which I will not bore you with, but I think we need to understand this question in the context of current legislation that applies, and if the law applies to the particular circumstance where a number of people should be paid a minimum wage, then that should be the case, and the labor inspectorate should enforce the law.
It's funny, this is a very live issue for me right now because we're launching a program at Georgetown in which we are taking people who are recently released from the DC jail and bringing them to Georgetown's campus for both work and study. And one of the tricky issues that we're dealing with is the technical question of, are they employees? Okay? So certainly someone who is an employee should be paid. Okay? And the question of whether they're an employee seems to kind of hinge on whether they are working for the benefit of the university or of a company or what have you, or is it more of a student relationship where whatever it is you're doing, when you go to school, you're doing that for the benefit of yourself. To me, it's not a black or white issue. I think it's very tricky. If we were to just say, okay, we're going to pay all interns, then I'd be afraid that we would be eliminating some of the opportunities for people to learn. So it's a live thing. I'm struggling with it right now. I don't have the answer, but I don't think it's quite as easy. My son was an unpaid intern, and I felt bad about that because he was able to do it where there were other people from different circumstances that were not. And so I didn't like the whole idea. But in some cases, it is providing an opportunity for the benefit of the person rather than the organization, and that's where I think it gets tricky.
And that's, I think, where the law also would, in the law, it's defined properly. If it's for the benefit of the organization, it should be salaried labor. If it's for yourself, that's what I was pointing at. If it's in the context of studies, it could be unpaid, and then you're doing it for yourself. But yes, to apply that to a real life situation, and it's not always 100% for the benefit of an individual or 100% for the organization. It can be in between, and that's where we need guidance from legislators, and because I'm sure GW is not the only university struggling with this issue. So.
Most schools have policies that define that. If it's unpaid, they have terms employer, that it's education, and that you're responsible
New York
to the
has
school.
great laws on that.
Yeah, so you're responsible to the school and unpaid.
Yeah, and I think it being tied to school and it being tied to a fashion house can be two different things too. Where I know a lot of young people who really want those opportunities, but like you were saying before, they don't have the money to move to New York, and so it ends up being a small, teeny percentage of the people who are can break in because they can afford the rent, and it gets tricky. It gets really tricky. But thank you too for that. There's a number of questions about automation in fashion, and I'm going to kind of combine them. What does automation in the fashion industry mean for the future of the U.S. workforce, the economy, and the sustainability movement?
I started this. So if we take a step back and with kind of a broader lens, and we say, okay, well, why does so much clothing production? Why did it migrate to China? Why did it migrate to Bangladesh? The answer that's always given is that, well, that's where wages are low. So this is an industry that chases low-cost labor, and that's kind of the explanation for the geography of the production. If we now introduce sobots, who can replace that labor, then you can ask the same question. Well, if sobots are an available technology, then where will the production take place? How will that production location decision be made? So if that's the technology in the industry, you're no longer going to be looking for low labor costs when you make your location decision. You're going to be looking for other things. You're going to be looking for things like reliable electricity. You're going to be looking for things like the availability of software engineers and high-skilled labor. So there's a whole nother set of things that are going to determine your location decision. And, you know, these are, when you start to talk about automation, these are the factors where it is the wealthy countries that have the advantage, because a SOBOT, you know, is really probably cheaper to run in the United States than it is to run in Bangladesh, you know, because of the institutional infrastructure and so forth. So I think that it's a very important trend. It's already happening. If you look at the labor force devoted to apparel in the universe today, this is a sharply declining curve. Okay, there are not more and more people working. There are fewer and fewer people working, and you don't need you know, a SOBOT to do everything in order for that production to move. About 10 years ago, they automated just the sewing of the side seam, okay, in t-shirts. Okay? So you took away that one step, so you took away one job from that factory. And then you automate the sleeves, and then you automate the hem, and it's kind of one thing at a time. And as that happens, that production will move, and the employment in the industry will shrink.
Who makes SOBOTs?
So who makes SOBOTs? There are a number of patents for SOBOTs, and there is a German company, a Japanese company, as well as an American company that all have patents for different kinds of SOBOTs.
And we're going to have this one be our last one. How can consumers know about a brand's labor practices in order to make a sustainable purchase? It's the question. So, anybody want to try?
From the Freed the Slaves perspective, we don't certify. I get asked a lot if we certify brands. We don't, but we do partner with brands who share our values. And the way we go about choosing who to partner with is by looking at third-party validation standards. So if they are fair trade certified, that likely means they live our values too. We've partnered with Done Good. I don't know if you guys are familiar. It's a Chrome extension. It's super awesome. And it'll help you shop ethically when you're online shopping. I think there are a number of ways to do some online research, but I also think, you know, I don't want to make it sound like it's simple. It does take work and it does take effort, but I think it's something we can all care about and commit to putting that effort into.
Obviously, ethical certifications like fair trade, but then also looking at credible organizations that are looking at sustainability practices in the industry. So Fashion Revolution has a great transparency index. Highly recommend that.
The Better Work program has all our brand partners on their website. So if you're interested to know who we're working with, go to www.betterwork.org. You will find them there. There's also part of the website that is called Transparency Portal.